Students often come in for help with beginning and ending their speeches. Knowing what constitutes an effective introduction and conclusion will help you assist them in making their speeches memorable. Introductions are important because first impressions are important. Speakers need to get the audience's attention and focus it on the topic, and they only have a limited amount of time to do that. Most speeches run between 5 and 10 minutes, and they need to spend the majority of that time on the body of the speech. So they need to fulfill all the functions of the introduction in around a minute to a minute and a half. They have to start with a good attention-getting opening statement, explain the topic and its relevance to their audience, establish themselves as credible to speak to the topic, and preview the body of the speech. There are lots of ways to get the audience's attention, but whatever they choose needs to be in keeping with what their topic is and who they're talking to. Ask them if in their research they found any startling statistics or good examples or stories. Those are often great ways to open a speech. Sometimes they might want to immediately relate to the audience, so a question, either rhetorical or direct, might be a good way to get the audience thinking about the topic. Then they need to talk a little about the topic, maybe give some brief background information on it. Make sure they don't forget their credibility statement. It's really important. Students often leave it out because they think they don't have any credibility, but assure them that they don't need to be an expert to be credible on the topic. Their interest, experience, and their research should be enough to let the audience know to listen to them. And finally, they need to tell the audience briefly what the main points are going to be before they get to the body of the speech. Conclusions can be particularly tricky. Students often ignore them because it's usually the last thing they write and they're often sick of the speech by that time. Plus, they don't think of them as being that important since they're so short, usually no more than 45 seconds to a minute long. But really, a good conclusion is as important, and sometimes more important, than a good introduction, because it's the last thing the audience hears, and the part that may stick with them the longest. One really effective thing to do in a conclusion is to link it back to the introduction. That's called a circular pattern. If a student starts with a story, for instance, then referring back to that story in the conclusion really lets the audience know that they're ending the speech. But regardless of whether they do that or not, they need to summarize, which is just reiterating what the main points were so the audience remembers them, and having a good, solid closing statement. It doesn't necessarily need to be a dramatic statement, although depending on the topic that might be appropriate, but it needs to be memorable and perhaps give the audience something to think about. You might try brainstorming with the student to come up with ways to end their speech. Students are always grateful when you can help them with introductions and conclusions. They really set the tone and help audiences relate to the topic and give them something to remember the speech by. Make sure your tutees can see the importance of doing them effectively.